Kelvin, and welcome to my final self assessment podcast. For my topic, I examined the effects of the discovery connected for the former Kamloops Indian Residential School and the call to decolonize the Canadian literary world. I presented my work through a digital scrapbook, and the website is titled Beneath the Silence. In this reflection, I will discuss my thought process, the choices I made, what I enjoyed, what challenged me, what I learned, and how this project helped me grow as a reader, writer, researcher, and critical thinker. Before I started this assignment, I understood that this topic needed to be handled with a great deal of care. I was not only analyzing a fictional text or responding to an imagined conflict, I was working with the experiences of real children, survivors, families, and Indigenous communities whose history has often been ignored, reduced, or told by institutions outside those communities. Because of that, my first goal was not to simply make the project look impressive. My first goal was to make it accurate, respectful, and meaningful. I began by reading the assignment several times and separating it into its main requirements. I needed an introduction, a thesis, images, social media posts, videos, TED Talks, children's literature, and analysis of Elie Wiesel's Night, critical literary lenses, diverse voices, and a complete works cited page. Instead of viewing these requirements as separate boxes to check, I wanted them to work together as part of one complete argument. The assignment described the digital scrapbook as a visual essay. That idea shaped the entire way I approached the project. I did not want the website to feel like a collection of random images, videos, and paragraphs. I wanted each page to have a clear purpose and to strengthen the larger message of the website. I also reflected on a previous digital scrapbook I have created about Night. That earlier project helped me understand what kind of organization worked well. Each lens has its own page, every media source was followed by analysis, and the website allowed the reader to move through the ideas without facing one extremely long essay. However, I did not want to simply copy that project and replace the Holocaust material with the residential school history. These two are distinct histories, and this topic required its own research, arguments, visual style, and emotional tone. I used my project earlier as an organizational guide, but I reconsidered every source and every connection based on the needs of this assignment. One of my first important choices I made was the title, Beneath the Silence. I chose this title because it represents several kinds of silence. It refers to the children whose names, experiences, and family connections were hidden beneath the incomplete records and official versions of history. It also refers to the voices of survivors and families that existed for generations beneath the version of Canada that many people were taught in school. Most importantly, the title suggests that silence does not mean that nothing is there. Beneath silence, there can be memory, grief, truth, resistance, culture, and knowledge. I wanted the title to introduce my main message before the reader even opened the first lens page. What I liked best about this assignment was the freedom to combine literary analysis, research, images, videos, social media posts, and all of this into a creative design. In a traditional essay, ideas are mostly communicated through paragraphs. In this project, I had to think about not only what I was saying, but also how the reader would experience the argument. I had to consider page order, section titles, image placement, visual balance, source credibility, and how much information a reader could take in at once. I chose to build a website because it allowed each critical lens to have its own section while still being connected to the same thesis. The website format also made the project feel more interactive than a standard essay. A reader could see how the Indigenous, feminist, Marxist, mental health, and powerless lenses asked different questions about the same topic. At the same time, the repeated page structure created consistency. Each section introduced a lens, presented media or literature, explained the connection, and returned to the main topic of Kamloops and the decolonization of literature. When I look back at this assignment, the part I enjoyed most was developing the different lens pages. Before this whole course, I sometimes thought of critical lenses as labels that could be placed on a text after reading it. During this project, I began to see them as a set of questions. Each lens guides the reader toward a different part of the issue. Through the Indigenous lens, I focused on colonialism, cultural erasure, Indigenous testimonies, storytelling, resistance, and the recovery of historical authority. This lens became the foundation of the website because it reminded me that Indigenous history should not be understood only through government reports or church records. Survivor testimony, family memory, Indigenous languages, oral traditions, and Indigenous literature are also valid and important forms of knowledge. Through the feminist lens, I examined how colonial violence affected women and girls in specific ways. This page drew attention to mothers, daughters, sisters, and indigenous women whose experiences can disappear when residential school history is discussed only in broad terms. It also helped me consider the role of indigenous women, how they have played in preserving memory, protecting family connections, speaking against injustice, and demanding accountability. Through the Marxist lens, I looked beneath the public language of education and examined the material system supporting residential schools. I considered government funding, church control, labor, property, access to foods, access to healthcare, and the unequal distribution of resources. This lens taught me that the oppression is not maintained through beliefs alone. It also depends on who controls land, money, labor, records, and basic needs. Through the mental health lens, I examined trauma, grief, fear, isolation, identity loss, and the effects that can continue across generations. This lens was especially important because it showed that harm did not automatically end when a child left a school, or when the institution eventually closed. The effects could remain through damaged relationships, lost language, silence, fear, and unresolved grief. Finally, through the powerless lens, I examined who was allowed to make decisions, whose testimonies were believed, who controlled records, and who had the power to define history. That distinction became one of the most important ideas in my project. It moved the discussion away from blaming communities for their suffering and toward examining the institutions that removed their authority. I also enjoyed finding connections that were not obvious at first. For example, I did not include an image simply because it looked emotional. I tried to study the details within it. Empty shoes could represent absence, childhood, interrupted identity, and public remembrance. A memorial could represent grief, but it could also raise questions about whether public sympathy leads to real action. The most difficult part of this assignment for me was maintaining depth without becoming repetitive. All 5 lenses were connected to colonialism and residential schools, so there was a risk that every page would repeat the same argument using slightly different words. To prevent this, I gave each lens a specific central question. For the indigenous lens, I asked who has cultural and historical authority. For the feminist lens, I asked how gender shapes experiences of colonial violence and whose stories are often missing. For the Marxist lens, I asked how labor, resources, funding, and property support inequality. For the mental health lens, I asked how trauma affects identity, relationships, and later generations. And finally, for the powerless lens, I asked who controls decisions, records, public memory, and the right to believe. Making these differences clear required planning and revision. Sometimes I found a strong source but realized that it repeated a point that I already made. Instead of including it only because it was powerful, I either changed the focus of the analysis or chose another source. This was really important so that there was no repetition throughout my whole entire assignment. Researching this topic also required me to think carefully about source authority. Whenever possible, I used material from indigenous organizations, indigenous speakers, the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, the Orange Shirt Society, and the community connected to the former Kamloops School. I still use other reliable sources when they were provided, but I did not want non-Indigenous institutions to become the only voices explaining Indigenous history. That choice directly supported the project's focus on decolonization. I believe I was most successful at synthesis, which means bringing different sources and ideas together to create a larger understanding. My analysis of night is one example of this. I made it clear that the Holocaust and Canada's residential school systems are different histories. I did not want to suggest that they are identical. The value of using night came from examining shared questions about institutional power, the destruction of identity, family separation, silence warnings, controlled labor, trauma, and the responsibility to preserve testimony. I was also successful in treating children's literature as serious literary evidence. Their simple language does not make their message simple. In many cases, focusing on the experiences of one child makes the larger system easier to understand. The reader sees what family separation, language loss, or cultural memory means within an individual life. 3 diverse voices discussed in class were also important to my understanding of decolonization. I tried not to present them as 3 names added only to meet a requirement. I considered how each voice challenged stereotypes, preserved knowledge, increased representation, or changed how Canadian readers understand Indigenous experiences. This helped me understand that decolonization is not simply about adding more Indigenous authors to a reading list. It also requires schools, publishers, and readers to reconsider who has been treating as an authority and which forms of knowledge have been valued. One major lesson I learned from this assignment is that decolonizing literature requires more than inclusion. Before this project, I might have described decolonization mainly as reading more Indigenous authors and teaching more Indigenous history. Those steps are obviously important, but my understanding now is deeper. A school can include Indigenous texts and still use a colonial structure if outside institutions continue deciding which voices are acceptable, how those texts must be interpreted, and which parts of Indigenous life are considered important. Decolonization involves a change in authority. Indigenous writers, survivors, families, nations, elders, and knowledge keepers need meaningful control over how their histories are preserved, published, taught, and understood. It also means respecting Indigenous language, oral traditions, cultural practices, and relationships to land as forms of knowledge rather than treating them as less important than written government records. I also learned that remembrance must involve more than emotion. Memorials, orange shirts, social media posts, and the moments of silence can create awareness, but awareness must lead to responsibility. It should lead to better education, access to records, support for communities, and accountability from institutions. Otherwise, remembrance can be temporary. The deeper question is not only whether people feel sympathy while the topic is receiving attention. The deeper question is what changes after the attention fades. Me personally, I would assess my work on this assignment as outstanding. I do not say that because I believe the project is perfect or because it contains a large amount of writing. I assess it as outstanding because of the planning, research, analysis, organization, creativity, and revision behind it. I developed 5 complete critical lens sections, each with a different purpose. I included a wide range of media and explained why each source mattered. I connected Night, children's literature, social media, videos, images, Indigenous testimony, and official sources to one central argument. I also used course terms such as symbolism, perspective, voice, silence, cultural erasure, intergenerational trauma, institutional power, material inequality, testimony, and decolonization. Most importantly, I believe the project shows growth in the way I think. At the beginning, my main question was, what happened? But by the end, my questions became more complex. Who controlled what happened? Who controlled the records afterwards? Whose testimony were believed? Who had the authority to define the history? And who was left out in the national story? That change in my questions is a strong sign of my learning. Something that I would like to improve on is the way I work with diverse voices. This means recognizing the limits of my own perspective, avoiding broad statements, using first-person and community-led sources, and understanding that research about marginalized communities should not become another way of speaking over them. My role as a student is to not act as the final authority on Indigenous experience. My responsibility is to listen carefully, evaluate sources responsibly, give credit, and examine how literature and institutions shape public understanding. My final goal is to carry the critical literacy from this project beyond English class. The 5 lenses taught me that every text, image, speech, policy, and news stories contain choices about what is included and what is excluded. I now pay more attention to who is speaking, who is absent, what ideas are treated as normal, and which institutions benefit from a certain version of history. Looking back, this project became much more than a website about one historical announcement. It became an examination of how Canada remembers, who is allowed to shape that memory, and what literature can do when official histories are incomplete. I am proud of the final result because the website reflects sustained effort, critical thinking, creativity, and growth. At the same time, this reflection has helped me recognize that the most valuable part of the assignment was not simply finishing the website. It was learning how to approach a difficult topic with greater care, precision, responsibility, and awareness. Ultimately, this assignment changed how I understand the purpose of literature. Literature is not separate from history, power, or public memory. It can preserve testimony, challenge dominant narratives, expose systems of oppression, and return individuality to people who are reduced to statistics or incomplete records. As a reader and writer, my responsibility is not only to understand what a text says, it is also to consider whose voice it carries, what silence it challenges, and what responsibility begins once I have listened. Thank you all for listening to my podcast.